We are still 2 minutes early, but we are too excited for the session. So let's start it. Let us
Hi.
begin, you and I, where the Shulni Literature Festival is spreading its wing under the sky. Welcome back to the most awaited session of the day one of Shulni Literature Festival, when we will meet renowned author Sidin Vadukut. For the discussion, I would like to introduce the moderator of the session, Professor Ashish Khosla, sir. Sir is presently
Hi.
the President Innovation and Marketing at Shulni University, which is indeed the most needed initiative in the pandemic time when suddenly everything shifted from the physical to online mode. Ashish sir has completed his PDGM from IIM Kolkata and engineering from PEC Chandigarh. Sir is an inspiration for all of us, believe me. Thank you so much, sir, for being the moderator of the session. And now I request you to introduce the well-known author and take the e-platform from here from me. Over to you, Ashish, sir.
Uh, Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here, Sidin.
It's
Sidin
my pleasure,
Vadukut is
pleasure, Professor Khosla.
great. Sidin Vadukut is the author of the best-selling Dork trilogy, a hilarious madcap wacky book series, which started in 2010 with the Dork, The Incredible Adventures of Robin Einstein, Verghese, and I have a copy of the book here.
Cup
And
here.
since great, well, they don't sell cups here. Maybe I'll get one of these one of these days. Since then, he's written a medical thriller and a non-fiction book called The Skeptical Patriot. Sidil is an engineer turned MBA, turned writer, turned entrepreneur, and now turning history philosopher. He has an MBA from IIM Ahmedabad and is currently the CEO and co-founder of All Things Small, a content company, and is based out of London. And he is now also pursuing a PhD in history. And incidentally, we have a few things in common, Sidin. You spent some time at Abu Dhabi, I understand, your school days.
Yep.
And I'm currently speaking from Abu Dhabi. So welcome to this LitFest. And let's start with a simple standard question. So you've written 5 books so far. How long does it take you to write a book, and what's your favorite time to write?
I have a fairly standard. I hope you guys can hear me. Yes.
Yes.
I have a fairly standard process. In fact, this is the longest since the last book I wrote is Bombay Fever, which I wrote in 2000 and which came out in 2017. It's the story of an international pandemic. And I wrote that. This is the longest I've been between books because it's been almost 4 years since I wrote that book. It's usually not that long. Usually what I do is I spend a year. I have a bunch of ideas. I let them sit in my head for a couple of months. And then I realize, okay, there's one of these ideas that I really like. I'll take that idea and I'll sit on it for roughly a year, 12 months, very open-ended. Like I don't even do none of those things. I just let it. Because one of the things I've realized is if 6 months later, the idea is still exciting to you, you should probably pursue that idea. And I'm somebody who my problem is I come up with so many different ideas. And the first challenge is really culling out and choosing the right one. And so I give that a year. And then once that comes into my head, I usually work in 2 stages. I do the first half of the book in 6 months. And then I do the next half of the book roughly in 6 weeks, which sounds really nuts, but I'll tell you the process there. So the first half of the book takes a lot longer because I'm not somebody who plans every detail in a book before I start writing. I just start writing. I usually know the opening sequence. I usually know how the first half of the book is going to go. And then I write 500 to 1,000 words a day and I write it over 6 months.
Okay.
6 months into the book, which is roughly 40,000 words into a book, then I know exactly what is going to happen. I've done all the corrections. I know all the characters. I know where this is going. If it's fiction, I know what I wanted to do. If it's non-fiction, I've completed all my research. I've done all my, citation building. I've done all of that stuff. And then what I normally do is I lock myself up. Pretty much, I go into this deep, intense writing mode, and I finish off the next half of the book in 6 weeks. Like I'll just write.
Wow.
And the last those 6 weeks are very intense. Like I sometimes write 10,000 words a day. I've written up to 12,000 words a day sometimes. And at the end of 6 weeks, I'll have the first manuscript. I'll have finished the first edit. And then I'll send it off to a publisher or whatever. But then I take a break. And I usually try to do a good first draft so I don't have to spend a lot of time on the second draft. So roughly, you're looking at a little over a year and a half, maybe a year and 8 months, roughly.
Interesting. Very interesting.
And it's become a rhythm for me now. That's the process I follow for every book.
And as you said, you basically leave it at a first draft, or you go in for a couple of drafts after that, if I may ask.
Usually three drafts. Usually three drafts. What I do is I try to do. It's not very efficient. A lot of writers don't try to write very rough first drafts. I try to write very complete first drafts. I don't like to leave a lot of work for the second draft. So I do the first draft. I send it to a publisher. They will do a lot of work on it. Send it back to me. I will do a second draft. Send it back to them. And then the third draft usually is a logical draft, just to make sure that it is not so much a language, a line edit. It's much more of it, does everything make logical sense? Like, to give you an example from Bombay Fever, which was the last novel I wrote, there was the sequence where in the book where somebody takes a flight from Bombay to, I think, Bhopal. And it's only in the third kind of logical edit we realize that the flight takes 3 days in the book, which is logically impossible. So we're like, okay, there's a problem there. So we need to kind of clear out the timeline. So that stuff happens in draft 3. All the line edits, all the language edits, tense, tone, all that happens in the second draft.
Very interesting. Now, before we move on, I've always wondered, actually, Sidin, I want to ask you this question: that who are these people who originally think of jokes which later become viral? So how do you come out with humor in your book? Are you a naturally witty person? How does that happen?
I think. I mean, there is a certain. I mean, there are many things, right? I mean, there are many things that make people funny, right? I mean, one sad commonality is a lot of people are funny because they've experienced kind of fairly difficult things in their lives, and they've used humor as a way of coping with it, right? The classic kind of Chandler Bing from Friends phenomenon, right? The guy's been through a lot in life, and then he copes with it through humor, and therefore. But I think there are multiple things. I think that's one of those. That's one aspect. I've experienced a fair amount of stuff in life. That helps you to kind of even laugh at the stuff that's happening to you. It makes you self-deprecating. You need a fundamental ability to step back from day-to-day life to see jokes. This, I think, is fundamentally important. If you take life too seriously, you cannot be funny. I mean, you cannot come up with jokes. And those are two separate things, but you can't do either of those things. So that's one thing. I think I feel like I have a really good sense for when things are absurd. Like, I have a nose for absurdity, right? And I think that's partly because I've done lots of different things. So I did my engineering I was born in India, but I grew up in Abu Dhabi. Then I moved back to India. Then I moved back to Abu Dhabi. Then I moved back to India. Then I did my engineering in Trichy. Then I worked in Chennai in a factory manufacturing things. And then I moved to a much more traditional office company. Then I did my MBA. Then I moved to... So I just kept on. I've just done so many things that it gives you a keen sense of... It really makes you good at noticing absurdities, I feel. Like doing lots of things. So if you look at like comedians or people who write a lot of humor and stuff, you'll notice that there's a lot of lack of settling in their lives. They're moving from place to place. They've done lots of jobs. So this, I think, has really helped me. I've done so much stuff. I still keep doing lots of different things. But I think I also I was very lucky to consume a lot of really funny literature when I was very young. So when I was very young, one of the pivotal moments, I think, in my life was when we grew up. I grew up in Abu Dhabi from roughly 1980 to 1996, around 16 years, roughly. Please tell me if I'm going completely off topic with these questions. So,
totally on topic. On topic, Sidin.
So I remember, this is very important for me. Right? I remember, my dad used to make me watch a lot of comedies. And I think, I don't know why, but he used to just watch. So I watched a lot of comedies when I was very young. And then what happened was, we didn't have a lot of money growing up. Like, we were kind of lower middle class, Gulf Malayali family, just enough money to come to India once every 2 years. It wasn't a very wealthy lifestyle. To the point where I remember if a new supermarket was opening, my dad would run from office to be in the first 100, 200 people because he got free stuff. I remember this. And there was a supermarket opening and my dad was in the first list of people to be there. At the end of it, he got like 3 frozen chickens, this, that, all kinds of random things. He also got a very small AM radio. And he came and gave me that AM radio. And I tuned in and I remember I discovered 2 things. I discovered English football because I would listen to BBC commentaries of English football. And I started listening to BBC radio plays. And some of these were very funny and they were completely absurdly funny. Like the very Monty Python, very 1960s, 1970s absurdist humor. And that's how I picked it up. And I picked this up very young. And I never completely lost it. And then slowly, I think every time I would go join engineering college, I would realize all this, I would just step back and realize, oh my God, this is so absurd. And I think that is what has really helped me notice absurdity, right? That's one thing. So there are very deep roots from where I started consuming comedy. And then I really obsess over the use of language. I really find language extremely useful. Like I keep telling, like I never use all 140 characters on Twitter. Like I use like half of them, because I find like economy of language is really good for comedy. So yeah, so it's a combination of things, where I come from, my interest in using language. I don't make a joke for it to go viral. I just make a lot of jokes. What people don't realize is that 30% of them completely fail. You know, there's a huge attrition rate. There's a, you know, the success ratio is not, it's true for all, I think, people who make jokes. So yeah, that's pretty much. And I've been very lucky in the sense that I did this. I've been on Twitter for, I think, 13 years at this point, 13 or 14 years. I was very early adopter. So I had a lot of audience before other people came in. So a lot of people listened to my jokes, you know, so I was just lucky. And the same thing happened to me when I was writing the Dork series. No one had written office culture comedy in India, I think ever. Or I think briefly, I think 60s, 70s, you had a couple of novels. So when I did that, I was early mover. So I was just very lucky in having audience, people share my jokes. So yeah, that's a very long and boring answer to a very fun question. So I'm sorry.
Well, that's a very insightful answer. But you know, I look at this 236-page book, and I'm sure there are 600-700 jokes inside it, right? So, do you plan that, or it just happens?
Roughly, yeah, 300 to 400 jokes. Actually, I measured this one. So roughly
you
300
do?
to
Wow.
400
Okay.
jokes. Yeah.
Okay.
I try to do a joke a page, roughly. Because I'll tell you why. Why, Professor. If you write a book saying this is a funny book, you have to make people laugh. There is no backup. Like if I'm a historian.
Call me Ashish Sidin.
Yeah, so Ashish, if you're a historian and you write a book, you can crack jokes in it. You can be funny in it. You can be insightful. You can find anecdote. You can do lots of interesting things. If you're writing a book on marketing, and if you're writing a Paco Underhill style book, or you're writing one of those style books, you don't have to be marketing in every page. You can do lots of other things. People will go with the flow. But if people buy a book saying this is a funny book, they expect to laugh every page. They will not say, oh, this was an insightful chapter, didn't make me laugh. They will not buy it. They want to laugh every page. So you need to write it that way. And that's, I think, it needs to make you laugh outwardly because it's just physically funny, or it needs to make you laugh inwardly, which is actually much harder. So that is the commitment. That's the contract you sign with the reader when you say this is a comedy book.
Interesting. So
it's a different relationship to other books.
Since you are talking about numbers and analysis, then let me ask you the next question, Sidin. How is it that some of India's most well-read authors are from the IIMs? And why do IIM graduates take to writing in the first place? For example, I myself have 3 class fellows who now turn to writing. So what is it about the IIMs that somehow inspires writers to start writing? Yeah.
That's actually a really good question. In fact, the answer, I think, has changed a little bit over time. But I think there are roughly 2 sets of answers. One has to do with the education that a lot of people who come into business school have. That's one thing. And there are questions coming. Do you mind if I answer the questions at the end? Is that okay?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, actually, yeah. No, I'll answer this. I mean, I'll probably come up anyway. So one of the things is has to do with education. The other thing has to do with the effect of Chetan Bhagat, and there's 2 different aspects here. And I was in Bombay during my summer internship 2004 when 5 Point Someone came out. I remember this very clearly. Oddly enough, my writing career is very closely related to that period, because I wrote a blog post that went kind of viral and completely changed my life the day before 5 Point Someone launched in Bombay. I just remember the timeline for some reason. So 2 things. Number one, I think if you're from an English medium educational setup, if you've come from a educational setup where you've read a lot, not necessarily for pleasure, but you've just read a lot of English books, you find an overrepresentation of these people in business school. If you went to Ahmedabad, if you went to Calcutta, if you went to any of the business schools, you see an overrepresentation of people from English medium backgrounds, people who've read a lot for pleasure. That's one thing. And I think you don't find a lot of IIM people writing in non-English. Huh? You find the majority of them writing in English. I think all of them write in English. So if you're there's a whole language overlap. Like if you're writing in English and you're from a young educated background, there is a probabilistic chance that you've been to a business school. This is one. The second thing is, I think another thing going on there is that a lot of people, a lot of MBAs, in the way they use language or they don't use language, are just used to writing a lot. And I think sitting down quietly, focusing and writing a lot is something that either you come to business school with, or is definitely something that is cemented into you when you leave business school. Second, the comfort of a steady, good income. The comfort of a steady, good income is so important. I mean, if you look at if you look at like something I read very recently, if you look at Virginia Woolf's very famous essay, A Room of One's Own, she says a steady income and a room to write in are just non-negotiables if you want to be a writer. And MBAs who have good paying jobs out of business school have both. You probably are not struggling to make your ends meet. You're probably not struggling to pay your rent. You're not doing two jobs. You've got a great 9 to 5 job or a 9 to 6 job. You come back and you've got that time. So there's this whole security, money, all of these things. But then there's the Chetan Bhagat phenomenon, and what he did was he made MBAs writing books. He made this very interesting thing, which is a lot of people want to go to business school. A lot of like MBAs and good business schools have a kind of a quasi semi celebrity status amongst many young Indians. And what Bhagat did was he kind of commercialized a certain insider's view of life at the IIMs. What is it to be an upper middle class person with a good income? What is it to be a romantic MBA? What is it to be all of these things? So he just and a lot of Indian publishers are very lazy. And I say this as someone who's worked with a lot of them. Indian publishers are very happy. One MBA writes a book, it'll do well. They'll commission books from 20 other MBAs. They're very happy to do this. If tomorrow a commerce graduate writes a great book, it succeeds, Indian publishers will happily go and find another 20 commerce graduates who know English and come. They're not super experimental. So Bhagat did this. And I think a lot of readers, the average young Indian is not an MBA with a good paying job. And therefore, there's a lot of interest in what is the lifestyle like, It is very closely related to TV shows that talk about wealthy people's lifestyles. I think it's very closely related to the Kuch Kuch Hota Hai phenomenon, which is early 2000s. A lot of Indians suddenly had this opportunity to kind of consume what rich people lived like. All of this is one continuum. I think it's a very nice 10-15 year cycle onwards from liberalization. You had enough rich people. There was a certain rich people's lifestyle that everybody wanted to look into. So a lot of factors are there. And I think it still continues. A lot of B school graduates continue to write books. But I think that phenomenon is beginning to kind of slow down. And I think there's a reversal to mean happening in Indian publishing. That's my feeling. Anyway, so multiple factors, I think. Language, education, market, Chetan Bhagat, lots of things.
Cool. So that's a question that's also come up somewhat in the chat. So what is the inspiration for Robin Einstein, the Dork character? What made you come up with this character in the first place? Is there an element of autobiography here? And I'm sure you've been asked this question before, but we'd like to know so would the audience.
Also, I'm sorry if I'm speaking very quickly. I'm a print journalist, so I'm much more like, I know how it's easier for me to do a word count when I'm typing. When I'm speaking, it's a little harder.
So you're going 150, 175 words a minute, right?
I know. I apologize. I'll try to be slower. So Robin Varghese was, especially book one is heavily autobiographical. It's heavily based on my experience across work, both before my MBA and after my MBA. And one of the things I wanted to, when I started writing, was like, I wanted to not have to spend a lot of time writing about a character whose background I had to research a lot. So I just said, look, the easiest thing is base the book around somebody who's roughly from my part of India, roughly from my social status, and roughly worked with the jobs I had. So that process was easy for me. I didn't have to imagine, if Dork was about, say, a Muslim woman from UP, I would have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what Muslim women from UP were like, what their lives were like. And I was very young, and I was like, let's just make this as easy as possible, which is why Robin was based very autobiographical. A lot of stuff in that book has actually happened in my life, exaggerated for comedic effect. A lot of the stuff in that book, especially book one. So what I did after book one was a lot of people started writing to me with experiences. So book one is very autobiographical. Book two is half autobiographical. Book three is heavily based on the experiences of 5 or 6 people who spoke to me. So it starts off very autobiographical, and then it kind of reduces as the series goes on. But I figure in a lot of my writing, fiction or non-fiction, my writing is heavily influenced by my experience as a person, my values, my journey as a writer, as a professional. So I figure a lot in my work. So Robin Varghese is 100%, the origin of that character is 100% autobiographical.
Oh, really? Interesting. So then next question is that as a writer, you've done various types of books, starting with the autobiography and then moving on to office humor fiction, then medical fiction, and then non-fiction. So how easy or difficult is it for you to traverse different genres? Does writing in one particular style not hinder your output in another? How does that happen?
I find like writing a book period is just very hard. The transition from genre to genre is not that hard for me because I leave a gap between books. Because I was lucky enough that I wrote my novels when I was a journalist, so I was both comfortable with fiction writing and fair amount of non-fiction writing. I've been lucky in that sense. So the transition from fiction to non-fiction is not that hard for me, my mind just works in that way. Like when I'm writing a non-fiction book, I'm in a non-fiction frame of mind. If I'm writing a fiction novel, I write in a fiction frame of mind. The difficulties come from other places. So if I'm writing a non-fiction book, I have a very laborious research process that is very, very hard. And I build up a lot of research work. Like my medical thriller is so research, it's practically a non-fiction book. I spoke to people at the World Health Organization on pandemic protocols. I read a whole bunch of United Nations protocols on pandemic stuff. I read on how viruses and bacteria work for roughly 6 months to 7 months. That's really hard. And then the problem with nonfiction is you've got all this information. How do you distill it into a book? In Bombay Fever is obviously a novel, but even there, how do you take all this nonfiction and distill it into a book? The Skeptical Patriot, I did months of research to write what is essentially a 3,000 or a 5,000 word chapter. So the distilling process is very, very hard. That's the challenge for me with nonfiction. It's very easy to get carried away with the research. It's very easy to overwrite. I'm fascinated by virtually everything, but readers are not. So you don't need to dump data on readers. They don't find. I love graphs. I love, I can go through graphs. I can go through scientific information reports. I can do that all day. Readers want you to tell the story. So that's the challenge with nonfiction. With fiction writing, I think the challenge is particularly the challenge is, okay, what's going to be the scope of this book? How many characters will be there? In some sense, Bombay Fever is the real true novel I've written when you think about it, because even if you think of Dork, each chapter is very short. They're all diary entries. And that you can clearly see the blogging background there, short posts one after the other. Yeah. The Bombay Fever is the first kind of real novel where there are long characters, long chapters, interconnecting arcs. All of this comes for the first time in Bombay Fever. That is its own challenge, right? And so I find fiction writing has its own challenges. It's you have to create this world that is convincing. You have to create interconnections that are convincing. You have to create dialogue that is convincing. You have to. I write and think and write like a English person who writes in English. So you need to do that in a convincing way. I find that really challenging. And often my problem is, how do I hold the journalist back when I'm writing a fiction novel, and how do I hold the novelist back when I'm writing a non-fiction book? So those are also challenges. But then the writing itself, like I said, is a challenge. So what I try to do is, once I flip into that mode, I try to stay there as long as possible. So if I'm writing a fiction novel, I try for as long as possible not to break my mental state, which means reading no other novels. I don't read any novels when I'm writing a novel. I consume very little other fiction when I'm writing a novel. It's very intensely immersed in that work. When I'm doing non-fiction, I try to do nothing else in that period. So especially when I was a journalist, writing non-fiction was very hard because your day job was non-fiction, your book was non-fiction. So that is quite hard. So yeah, so that's again, both are difficult, both are different. I don't find the transition difficult. I just find writing itself just challenging.
Okay, so that means that there is some kind of a writer's block somewhere. How do you cope with that? Yeah. So how do you cope with that?
There is deep writer's block. There is tremendous imposter syndrome. Like after all of these books, I'm still terrified when I write the first draft of something and give it for feedback. And I've been working as a journalist on and off for like 13 years now. And I've written so much. At one point, I was writing 100 articles a year for the Mint business newspaper. It has done nothing to reduce my sense of insecurity when I write. I still feel a little bit. What it's done is it's made the process easier. Like when I'm writing, the flow is much more natural. But it is there. There is insecurity always. There is a lot of imposter syndrome even now. Writer's block is there. What I do, every writer's block is a problem, and every writer has their own way of dealing with it. What I do is I have workflowed, and I have overthought. I have obsessively worried about workflow for the last 10-15 years. Like when I started writing, I would obsessively read about how do writers write. And I don't mean in terms of language. I mean, where do they sit? Do they sit on a computer? What software do they use? Do they write in the morning or evening? I obsessively worry about this.
So why did you share that with us? What's your workflow broadly, and where do you sit, and what software do you use, and how do you get yourself to write those 1,000 words a day or 12,000 when you move into phase 2?
So I have lots of little things. So Most of my writing happens in 2 stages, 3 stages. I mean, number one is outlining, and I just write outlining stuff, which is just bullet pointed lists. And there's a piece of software called Workflowy. It's been around for many years. People who know it know it. People who don't know it have never heard of it. Workflowy is a very interesting. Workflowy essentially makes bulleted lists, but the beauty of Workflowy is you can do this infinitely, and you can then zoom into one. So I can say novel ideas, crime novel, under crime novel, title of working title, under working title, chapter 1, and I can click on chapter 1 and everything else vanishes, and I can just work on chapter 1. This is a wonderful piece of software. I've been using it for many years. It's really good for outlining, just title headings, ideas, and so on. So it's called Workflowy. And then I always write in one piece of software. Currently, I'm using something called Craft but many novels before that, I used to use a piece of software called Ulysses, which is, all of this is only on the Mac because I've been using Mac for around 10 or 12 years. But there are other versions for stuff. And what I don't like writing in Google Docs. I don't like MS Word. I don't like any of those toolbars, font, nothing. I just like a clear white screen, a serif font, and I just write. So, usually what I write is every day I write 1,000 words. I set a goal. But the important thing is, how do you make sure that next day when I wake up in the morning and I sit in front, it starts? So what I try to do is a couple of things. One is I always end one day halfway into a sentence or an idea. I never end a chapter on one day, ever. I ended in such a way that, okay, then he woke up and went to, and then in brackets I'll write he went home, and then I'll finish. So the next day I go, there is no starting trouble. I know I have to finish the previous line. I always realize that starting is the hardest bit. So make that as easy as possible for you, right? This is very important. So I always leave, at the end of a day, I always leave it with a half sentence or a half chapter. Never finish a chapter. It's a nightmare for me because I can never start a new chapter the next day from scratch.
And then once you started, the thoughts just keep coming on.
It'll just keep coming. Don't go back and edit. Don't worry if it's perfect. Just write. 1,000 bad words is still much better as a writer than like 20 great words, so just write. So that's one. That's a very big process, and you have to make it super fiction free in the sense that you should be able to come to your computer, open the app, start writing. There should be no other thing. It should work offline and online. This is very important for me. So I have to pick up my laptop and go somewhere. I should just be able to open and start writing. So you should not find Wi-Fi, this and that. Just make it super easy. This is very important for me. The other thing I also do is I don't necessarily write a book linearly. I can often go back and forth in the thing because no book is fun to write. Every chapter is not fun to write in any book. There are good chapters, there are bad chapters. And what I try to do for myself is, if you write a bad chapter, gift yourself with a good chapter afterwards. There'll always be chapters you like writing. Like there'll be chapters you don't like, there'll be chapters you like. This. Make sure you alternate between them because they're much more fun to write. And then the other thing I always do is I gift myself like mad when I'm writing a book. I'm like, if you reach 5,000 words, buy a DVD of this. If you reach 10,000 words, play that video game. I do this constantly. It sounds like I'm a high school child, but I love doing it. You have to reward yourself. So this is a combination of stuff. Make the writing process super, super simple. Plan first so that you don't want to sit, write, and then halfway through your writing have to plan. Don't do that. Just plan everything beforehand. The third tool I use, especially for nonfiction, is I actually approach almost all my writing like academics would approach a paper write. So I've got a software called Zotero that is used for saving PDFs, journal papers, web links, citations, all of that stuff. And I use that religiously. I've been using that for many years. I use that to store not just my MPhil PhD work, but my newspaper articles. If I'm doing work for All Things Small, any content stuff, everything goes into that. And the final step in this puzzle is, if you have a smartphone or you have like anything, have somewhere where you can write every idea without worrying about categorization. You should have an idea dump on your phone. Don't categorize, tag, nothing. Just write, what if he is a diplomat, and just save it and keep it. And every once in a while, go through your ideas. So just writing is very hard, thinking is very hard, planning is very hard. Be kind to yourself and make it as easy as possible.
That's very insightful, Sidin. In fact, if you don't mind, we'll take a clip of this and show it to our students whenever this issue comes up. And that's a very common question.
Please do.
So do you have a certain, you have a best time to write, or that varies with time? Best time, best window seat, something like
that? I have, so in some sense, no, like as long as I'm in my office and I'm surrounded by my books, like this is my office, this is where I work, I'm happy. I can keep working. It's not a problem for me. And sorry. And what I also do is I have a couple of I work at, there are a couple of libraries I really like. I want comfort. I don't want to be surprised by stuff, but I also don't want to be completely alone. You want a little bit of noise. They call it passive socialization. You like some noise around you. It's really good.
Right.
Also, I get a lot of ideas just listening to other people speak, going to a museum. So there are particular places I like. So when I was living in Delhi, there's this room in my flat in Dwarka. I used to live in Dwarka, and that overlooked a park, and I used to really like working in that room. That was really nice. I used to work in there used to be a Costa in Connaught Place. I used to work there, very standard place. In London, I have a couple of places I like working in my office a lot. I like working at the British Library. I've worked there for many years. I really like the feel. It just feels nice to work there. There is another library called the London Library, which has got this very particular writing room, which is underground. And the writing room is underground, but they have this clear opening to a skylight, so the sunlight comes in. I love that room. But what I've started doing for the last 2 or 3 projects is, and this sounds pardon if this sounds extremely bourgeois and it's shamefully expensive, but it's not very expensive. There's this library called the Gladstone Library that is just across the border with Wales. It's a 1-hour train journey from London. They've got a residential library, which is a library with bedrooms outside. Okay. So you check in there, you go into the library, you take a table, and you put your stuff down. And then 24 hours a day, the library is open, and you can just go from your room whenever and write. And it's a wonderful library. It's got creaking floors, and it was set up by Prime Minister Gladstone, I think 150 years ago. It was meant to be a library for training priests, Anglican priests, but today it's open to anybody. And it's a really nice place. It's very quiet. It's in the middle of nowhere. There are no TVs in your room. The rooms are not very expensive. You have to have dinner at 6 p.m. They do not serve dinner after that. And you can work in the library as long as you want to. And they only have radios in the room. There is no TV. And there's Wi-Fi, but you can only look at your laptop for so long. I find it a wonderful place to work in. So I do my second edits and my last drafts always at the Gladstone Library. And I've done that for the last 3 books. Really nice place. And you can have a mountain of books. They don't care. The table is yours for the duration of your stay at the place. I encourage people, don't find a Gladstone Library, but find a place that inside your house, but also outside, that you find really secure, where you can leave your books, you can leave your laptop, find that place and then cherish it, because you will develop a very symbiotic relationship with that place. I find it very symbiotic.
Since we're getting a lot of questions from our YouTube broadcast as well, so I'll try to quickly take you through some of these. But first is one of my own, which is, in your book, The Skeptical Patriot, you explore some of the most popular facts about India.
Yeah.
And you also dig out the truth behind them.
Yeah.
So can you take us through one surprisingly difficult to believe myth that's actually true?
Let me see. That's a really good question, actually, because for example, the idea that India invented the zero. Let's just give you a couple of examples, right? That India invented the zero, right?
That's true. That's true, isn't it?
It's not anymore. But that's the interesting thing with that, because it all depends on the first archaeological evidence of the zero. And it's very funny. I was literally writing the chapter for my book when they discovered new evidence in Cambodia, which then further predated and even the earliest zero in India, right? You would assume that there are lots of zeros. The earliest evidence of a zero in India is one temple outside the Chaturbhuja temple outside the fort in Gwalior. And that one temple is why we think India had the earliest zero. But then in Cambodia, they discovered a zero that was even earlier. So it's just and it is so hard. I mean, when you try to think about, because that chapter became very hard, because you're like, what is a zero? I mean, it comes down to that question. Like, it's not like people didn't know the idea of nothingness before. Like, people often say, right? Like, look at the Romans. The Romans didn't have Indian Arabic, Indo-Arabic numerals. The Romans didn't have zero. They weren't capable of, so they couldn't build great things. But the Romans built unbelievable things without the zero, without a number system. They built aqueducts that spanned Italy. They built the Colosseum. They built massive works of public architecture with basic mathematics, right? So that chapter was really hard. I mean, when you actually sit down to look at where does the zero come from, who came up with this idea, it was really hard. That was really hard. And then, for example, did Ayurveda invent plastic surgery, right? What happens when you look at these myths is that they are true if you choose to take a very narrow definition of things like plastic surgery. They're true. But then if you take a slightly more magnanimous view, things are complicated. I mean, there are lots of influences that come back and forth. And, or for example, right, I'll give you an example of another complicated, like for example, the idea that the Taj Mahal somehow sits or used to be a Hindu temple. Very, very popular myth. It's been there for many, many years. It is both true and false. It is true because the Taj Mahal was clearly built on what was previously, I think, a home that belonged to a very rich Indian man. Shah Jahan buys this land from him and builds the Taj Mahal on top. So without a doubt, there's going to be a temple underneath. But was it you know what I mean? But was a temple replaced with? No. And we have so much documentary evidence of this. I mean, the building of the Taj Mahal is actually really well documented. We know where they got the marble from. We know this. We have records of where they got the marble from, how much they paid their people. So these things are hard. And you realize at the end of all this that you can do great work historically, you can do great research, but it's really hard to convince people of stuff that they don't want to be convinced of. And for me, actual learning from writing the Skeptical Patriot was not so much which of these myths are true and which of these are false, but where these myths come from. And these myths are actually very new. This is what I learned. These myths come from the late 1980s and early 1990s, and the vast majority of them come from Indian students and professors in the US. This is the origins of a lot of these myths. And I believe the reason is because a lot of these guys, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, when a lot of Indian students started going to the US, and many of them had stepped out of India for the first time, they felt really bad for themselves. They felt like, oh my God, my country is genuinely poor, right? And they felt really uncomfortable with that. And they went to the US. Many of them faced, I think, pretty bad racism, pretty bad, were treated really badly. And they wanted to create a national myth. They wanted to create a legend for where they came from. They wanted to convince people that India was great. And some of it starts from a place of, I think, from good faith, but then it quickly spirals into really bad faith arguments. You would be surprised how, if you look at these, if you search on the internet for the earliest mentions of this stuff, they go back to student websites in the 90s. They go back to faculty websites in the 90s. It's really interesting. Anyway, I mean, that's again a long answer. But
so since you're talking about history, and you seem to be very focused on history now. So you've done all engineering, MBA, history. So what are you truly trying to learn through your degrees? I mean, what is it that you're looking forward to fundamentally grasp?
That's a good question, because man, you are asking me only questions that have like 5,000 word answers. But,
okay.
I'll try to do it less than that. So no, very quickly. So my PhD specifically looks at the role of coinage in the early Islamic economy. Early Islamic monetary policy is what I look at. And all aspects of it, which is not just in terms of monetary policy and how money enabled the economy, or how money built a cash economy, which is very interesting, but also where the coins came from, where the silver came from, where they were manufactured, how did the money flow across Northern Europe, all this is very interesting. How the Western Mediterranean economy was pretty much propped up by Arab silver for a period of a couple of 100 years. I mean, these are all interesting questions. My much broader interest is, increasingly my real interest is in understanding how ideas intersect with how people live their lives. The kind of the lived experience of ideas, or the experience of religion, economy, all of these things, and how it interacts with people's lives, and how that translates into really interesting personal and social stories. This is my interest. Like, how did early Islamic notions of money impact the life of early Muslims and early non-Muslims? This I'm fascinated by. But then how did this also impact the making of money? But then how did the making of money impact the ecosystem, impact trade, impact the way we live today? And it is utterly fascinating. I mean, to give you an example, there's a very famous dinar called Offa's dinar. Offa's dinar is this gold coin that was found in the UK. And I think it dates to the 11th century. So it's 10 something. Offa's dinar was minted in Wales by a king, or in England by a minor king, as part of tribute that he wanted to send to the Pope in Rome. But to convince the Pope that it was a good quality coin, he imitated an Arab dinar.
Oh.
Because Arab dinars at that point were considered the best quality gold coins. So you have these gold coins which actually have the Shahada and the profession of faith, but it's written in gibberish Arabic, because they don't know what Arabic looks like in England. But they know that the Arabs were making good coins. And it is one of the British Museum's, for me, most fascinating coins. Or you have the Aidmar. This is one of the world's most famous coins. There's a coin called the Aidmar. Only 80 copies of these coins have been ever discovered. When they come up for sale, they sell for tens of thousands of dollars. The Aidmar coins were minted to commemorate the assassination of Julius Caesar. Specifically by them. And it was minted by the people who killed him. So anyway, so I find all of this, the idea that Caesar was killed, but then they wanted to make a coin, but then the coin had to have a symbol of Caesar's assassin. I find all of this is utterly fascinating. So in some sense, what I'm doing is combining all of the things I've learned: the science from my engineering, the idea of markets and economy from my MBA, and the ability to ask questions and work with archives that I learned as a historian. I'm kind of combining all of these things into my work. I find it
So will
utterly
you
fascinating.
then combine it with the writer in you, and can we
Yeah.
now expect a historical fiction series? In the
I think so.
future?
Yeah.
Oh,
I've
great.
been wanting to write a
Yeah.
series set in during the First World War amongst the
Okay.
Indian diaspora in the UK. I've been
Hmm.
wanting to do this for a long time.
Okay.
I've been wanting to write. I'm giving away some of my. I've been wanting to write a crime novel set during the Dandi March. I know it sounds really weird, but I've been thinking
Hmm.
about this for a couple of years as well. Yeah, so I want to write all kinds of stuff
Those
because
are interesting
Ashish,
ideas,
I'm
Sidin.
lucky.
Yeah.
I'm lucky that somebody will publish what I write. I'm also
Yeah.
lucky that I have a source of income that doesn't depend on my work. I'm very
Hmm.
lucky in these things. I'm like, might as well just try lots of things.
Hmm. Talking about your work, I understand you're currently an entrepreneur in the media space,
That's
Sidin,
correct.
and
Yes.
tell us a little bit about All Things Small.
So All Things Small was set up 2 years ago. I got together with a bunch of my friends and we said, look, can we make a company that makes non-fiction, true story based content and make it profitably from India? And this was when shows like Narcos was doing really well. Sky
Hmm.
had produced Chernobyl. The West was consuming a bunch of content that was inspired by true stories. So we said, look, can we do this from India? Not just stories out of India for India, but stories out of India for the world. So we got some seed funding out of a fund in Bombay around middle of 2019. And then immediately we produced a bunch of podcasts for Spotify. We've done a bunch of videos for Netflix's YouTube channel. We are very close to signing a deal to do a true story based docu-series for one of India's major streaming platforms. We are doing a whole bunch of work: audio, video, branded
Okay.
content, everything.
Interesting.
And the common thread is they're all based on research. They're all based on true stories.
Hmm.
We have a massive World War II true story set in Bombay during the Second World War that hopefully we'll be able to announce end of this year. Lots of things. Lots
Okay.
of really
Very
interesting.
interesting. Very interesting. So, Sidin, tell me, creative people are supposed to be different, prone to swings and moods. You have Van Gogh as an example. So, what is about you as a person which is different from the norm?
Oh man, I am prone to, especially towards the end of a project, I go into this complete crash. Like it's a very, very bad crash. And it takes me a long time to come out of it. Moving to the UK was very hard. The lack of sunshine, like I find winters very hard to work in. The lack of sunlight for me, as somebody who grew up in the Gulf and in India, the lack of sunlight is a huge problem.
Can imagine that.
I can be, especially when I'm really focused and working and stuff. It takes a toll on your family as well, because if anybody disturbs you, it's very, very hard for me if I'm in a strain of thought. It's quite hard to fall in and out of focus. Yeah, I have a lot of I can be quite abrasive if I'm disturbed when I'm working. I can be if people when people give me feedback, I will sit them down and tell them to give it to me in real detail, and this freaks people out and they don't give me feedback, so I have to pin them down and say give me feedback, and then I will ask them to justify every piece of feedback they've given me. So this can be quite hard. But most of all, I think, like I said before, the deep sense of insecurity, the idea that everything you're writing is crap. I think a lot of writers will agree with this. If you write something and you share it with somebody and they give you feedback and they tell you it's good, I am programmed to dismiss all positive feedback as lies to make me happy and overvalue all negative feedback as something fundamentally wrong with my work. It is really hard on your mind. But you need feedback. So how do you balance this? This is a problem. And like I said, the imposter syndrome, the conviction that you're only getting published because somebody at Penguin likes you, or you're only doing well because your friends are buying your book. Nobody actually likes anything you write. I deal with this every day. And I've been writing for 13 or 14 years now. So it's really, technically I've been writing for 17 years this year, ever since I started blogging. And this still freaks me out. The idea that actually everything I'm writing is bad.
Well, that's nice. Well, it's kind of reassuring to know that for people who haven't written a bestseller, so then that you're thinking you have these insecurities, right?
Oh yeah.
So I think that's a motivation for people who want to write and say, don't worry, deal with your insecurities and go ahead and write, right? So we are now actually coming to the end of this very interesting talk now, Sidin. Thank you very much.
No problem.
One last question. Who are some of the authors? What genres have you read and enjoyed recently? Unless you're writing something, which is when you stop reading, you said.
No. I've been reading. I read indiscriminately. There was a period when I used to read only fiction. Then I started reading only non-fiction. Now I mix and match and read a bunch of things. So I love William Dalrymple's work. Very influential on me when I started writing, because I remember I finished From the Holy Mountain. I remember that moment. I finished that book, put it aside, and thought, imagine having the power to create visions in readers' minds like this. Maybe I should try writing. And this was a pivotal moment. This is when I really started thinking I should take writing seriously. So I love William Dalrymple's work, very, very influential on me. I love Bill Bryson's work because he really is very good at taking lot of research and making very accessible to a general reading audience. I really like his work a lot. I read a lot of crime novels. I love, especially crime novels in translation. So there's an Italian author, he passed away recently, called Andrea Camilleri. I love his work, very cinematic, which is why a lot of his books have been adapted for screen. So I write everything. Everything is written. I love reading. I love. There's this Australian writer called Matthew Riley. Okay, let me be honest. These are not the world's best books. They are complete masala action novels, completely implausible. They're utter nonsense, and I completely love these books. It's all planes flying over into a mountain. It's just bizarre. I love these books. I read every single one of them. I've been reading all of his new book came out 3 weeks ago. I just finished reading it 2 days ago. Love his work. It's amazing work. Within Islamic history, I love Hugh Kennedy. I read all of Hugh Kennedy's work. It's really good. I'm reading India in the Persianate Age by Eaton. Really good book. Came out a couple of years ago. It's about it's between the years 1000 and 1800 in India and the influence of Persians in India. Really good book. I love Chris Wickham. He's a medievalist, very influential medievalist. Love Chris Wickham's work. Samit Basu, very briefly at IIM Ahmedabad, he dropped out, I think, in year 1. Writes science fiction novels. Love Samit Basu's work. Really wonderful guy. Really like his work. Gautam Bhatia, good friend, again a good writer. Really like his work as well. So I read indiscriminately. I read a lot of work. Martin Cruz Smith writes the Arkady Renko crime novels. I've read every one of them. Valerio Veresi, Italian crime writer in translation. Love. So yeah, a lot of crime, a lot of historical writing. John Julius Norwich, I've written about this before, passed away a few years ago. Wonderful historical writer, a non-fiction writer. Yeah, so I like all of these. And someone I've just discovered recently who writes historical fiction is C.J. Sansom. C.J. Sansom writes historical crime novels set during the rule of Henry VIII. Absolutely wonderful. So yeah, I know that's a big list and I've spoken at 1,000 words a minute, but I thought I'll just cram lots of ideas in.
Thank you very much. In fact, at 1,000 words a minute, we have a lot of action-packed stuff for somebody to go through this 45-minute talk and look at the insights that you shared with us. So thank you for that.
No, I'm
insights
happy.
Right from what makes you click as a writer to how you handle your writer's block and the softwares that you use. To your insights about how you're progressing from autobiographical humor to historical fiction now. So thank you very much, Sidin. And there actually are a lot of questions there with me. So probably we'll hopefully leave it for the next lecture that we have. That's all I can say.
I'm really sorry. I spoke so much I couldn't answer some of these questions. Please email me. Nice. Email me. I'm happy.
We'll catch you again at some other lectures. Thank you very much for being here on behalf of everyone here.
All the best for the festival. Regards to everyone at Shulini. Take care, guys. See you.
Thank you, Sidin. Thanks a lot.